Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, and thanks for having me. Can you hear? Make yourself comfortable and sit like this, like a comedian. Okay, how's that? Does it sound okay? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about where I work, where I've worked for 3 years, Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art, and our endeavour to turn the museum into something else for what we might call post-artistic times. And this image is very pertinent. I assume you recognise the lady on the left, Margaret Thatcher. This is her visit to Middlesbrough in 1987. And she's walking across the rubble of the broken steelworks, the steelworks that closed. And this is her announcing to the public about the new dawn of the end of dirty industry and the beginning of our new neoliberal economy, effectively. So this is the moment when the world changed in some ways, particularly for Middlesbrough. This sets the scene for everything that's happened since. This is MIMA. It's called MIMA because they wanted it to be like a mini MoMA. That's the whole point. This is the classic Guggenheim scenario. So this, even places like Middlesbrough, which are up in the north of England where nobody goes, they too want their museum that puts them on the map, that makes them a player in the world. So this is architectural regeneration of the kind of third, fourth, fifth generation maybe. So it's a glamorous building designed by a Dutch architect, of course, because that's the kind of person you bring in to regenerate your town. This is MIMA sat in the centre of town. This is the town hall, the law courts, the library, in the middle of the square, right in the middle. And if we draw out further, this is Middlesbrough from the air, or Teesside as it's known. So basically it's a chain of industrial towns along a river near the coast, very similar to the Ruhr Valley in Germany, or many other places where you have these developments of industry along a river. Total population of about 750,000 people. And if you zoom out further, this is the map I used to describe where Middlesbrough is. Oh look, I can use my pointer. Here we go. If I do this, is that right? Oh, that one. There we go. So Middlesbrough is up here. London's down here. This is Middlesbrough here, and this is where you zoom in to where Middlesbrough is. And this is actually the Brexit Map of Britain. So this shows you geographically where Middlesbrough is, but also politically and sociologically where Middlesbrough is. Middlesbrough, this black spot, is the highest voting Brexit region in Britain, with 82% of the population voting for Brexit. So that's the mindset, and it's because it's a post-industrial place. It's a place that was left behind by globalization, left behind by capitalism. This is the psychology of Brexit. And this is the steelworks, the reason why Middlesbrough exists. Basically, Middlesbrough was a farm of 40 people in 1830. They discovered coal and they discovered iron ore, and then it suddenly exploded into the largest steel producing town in the UK and one of the largest in Europe. And there's the steelworks from the air. But 2 years ago, it closed down for good. The steelworks was finished. It was in the hands of a Thai company. Previously, before that, Tata Steel from India. It had been handed from company to company to try and make it work, but finally the doors closed and 8,000 employees were made redundant, and the whole reason for the town existing was gone. And Middlesbrough was in a kind of bad place already ever since the 1980s, and Margaret Thatcher started closing the place down. But even more so now, to the extent where we had headlines like this to describe Middlesbrough as the new Detroit in Britain, or Britain's Detroit, which was very easy to see why that would be the case, because this is what it looks like 500 metres from the gallery. This is a neighbourhood called Gresham that I'll talk about later, where there were so many empty houses, they started demolishing them, but with no plan with what they would do next. A real kind of complicated mess of what happens when a town starts to collapse. And also in this vacuum, this created an enormous influx of migrants and refugees in a town that was really built on migration anyway. Nobody is really from Middlesbrough. As the town boomed, everybody came from somewhere else, essentially. But the real intensity of this migration was felt 1 year ago when it was hit national headlines that all the refugees were being housed in houses with red front doors. And they were being targeted by right-wing extremists because they knew where the refugees lived, because they all had a red front door. But this was not because of, some sort of, not by design, but just by, there was one landlord, a very rich landlord, who was buying lots and lots of cheap houses, and then he had a contract with a multinational company that had a contract with the British government to relocate refugees and asylum seekers, where he basically gets about 50 euros per night per refugee that he houses. So basically it becomes a huge machine of migration control centred on Middlesbrough, created by private enterprise. And poor guys like this are the ones who feel the brunt of it. So for me, this is kind of like, this is the figurehead for where we are now. This is the figurehead of our times, you might say. This guy kind of lost outside this red front door house that he doesn't really think of as home. If we kind of go back, there's another figurehead that I use quite a lot. I think I have this slide in pretty much every talk I do. I apologize for it. Yeah. But for me, it's a very pertinent image. It's Caspar David Friedrich's Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog from 1818. And it basically is, I describe this as the image for the box of modernity. So if you bought the software for modernity, for the modern era, this would be the image on the box. And it represents the individual artist, the artist as male hero genius leading us into the future, the idea of art separate from society, the idea of us as individuals not necessarily connected with a collective identity, but one in which the individual is driving our nationhood forward. And the software engineer is this person, who is this German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who in a way wrote the software for our modern context, and particularly with art. So in terms of trying to understand what the hell you do with a contemporary art museum in a town like Middlesbrough, it's very clear to me that you need to rewrite the software. And one of the problems that MIMA has had before I went there as director was that it was under fire from the local population. We don't need an art gallery. We don't need contemporary art. This is colonialism. This is a language from London, from New York, from Paris, from Tokyo, but it's not a language for us. It's not working for us. So we need to make the museum work, but in new ways, and rethink the idea of how art functions. And again, a lot of the work we've been doing over the last 5 years with a whole host of museums, including SALT, as a range of institutions, trying to rethink what the hell we do with art and what we do with our institutions that are situated in public space, of how we get them to work more effectively in society. And I kind of personify this with this diagram, which you can call the parabolic arc of modernity. So it starts somewhere in 1848 as, cultural, economic capital increases in Europe to a hiatus around 1917, and then drops off in 1989. So 1848 is the year of revolution and the barricades in Paris, and 1989 is the year of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the rise of the World Wide Web. So that in a way, between those two positions, that's the kind of height of modernity, the height of Eurocentric culture. But beyond this, where do we go next? Do we drop off the earth, or do we rise again, or do we go somewhere else? This is the question. So in trying to work this out, and trying to work out what kind of architecture we needed, I began to look at kind of historical moments before 1848. What was happening otherwise in the world? So when the world went that way, with industrialization, with capital, with the art market, what would happen if we went the other way? And who else was going the other way? And certainly in Anglophile history, there are very pertinent things which I kind of look at to say, actually, in there is the seed of something else that we might try now, or we might pick up again, or something that was buried that we can allow to rise to the surface again. One of them, which is very important, was the Institute. And in Britain in 1800, the first institute, or Mechanics Institute, was created. Now, Mechanics Institute means mechanic not in terms of engineering, but in terms of the hand. It's from the Latin of the hand. And the institutes were created to teach the working classes about new technology, so that you would have a better workforce and a more productive economy as the country rose and grew and created new technology. But at the same time, there were places where people came together to learn art and about culture and a whole host of things which would give them well-rounded lives and a better condition for living in. These aren't great slides, but this is Leeds Mechanics Institute, which really, you can, in this picture basically is a display of all the activities of the institute, which includes steam engines and chemistry, but also includes flower arranging, horticulture, life drawing, fashion, all kinds of activities that everybody does. And these also culminated in the Great Exhibition of 1851, which kind of set the tone for our exhibitionary era. So if you know your sort of museum studies, this is a kind of key moment in the development of the museum. Interestingly, institutes are also the place where, as working classes came together, they also started to co-organize and group organize from the ground up. So unions, women's liberation, the free vote, all these mechanisms began in the institute as well, counter to the ideas of the people who were running them. So a kind of very interesting moment, and a lot of them became universities or art galleries or museums very quickly after that. Another figure who I cite a lot and is relevant here is the artist, writer, social reformer, political activist, economist, John Ruskin, who again is a character who's been slightly suppressed, certainly in British history, but has had an enormous influence on shaping the world, but certainly shaping the world of art. But a lot of what he really was proposing was not listened to or wasn't taken notice of. And certainly when I did my art history education, nobody told me about John Ruskin, not in the terms I'm going to talk to you about now. But really I would describe him as kind of the first artist social activist. He was Professor of Fine Art at Oxford University, and the first thing he got his art students to do was build a road. This is in 1872, where he got all his students to build a road between two villages to stop the spread of cholera, because it was across a marsh. But they should also make it the most beautiful road in the world as well, in order to kind of basically apply artistic competency and artistic thinking into everyday life. This was the absolute principle of John Ruskin. But he also applied this into other ways of learning and education. He's very, very well known in the world of education. And he also developed, for example, a system of learning through the institute movement for workers, for mine workers or for mill workers. And the idea was men, for example, would do wood carving in the evenings after they'd been down the mine. They would come up in the evenings, go to the institute, and they would make things out of carved wood. The women, because it was still Victorian society, they had separate crafts for separate genders. They made lace, and this is a photograph of an early lace class that John Ruskin organised, where they actually even had to make the spinning wheels, because spinning wheels were even out of date even in 1878, and they produced lace products that they could sell and earn a bit of money, but also a way for them to think through making and think through working with the hand and working communally together. And this was a way of orchestrating and educating society through creativity. Another version of this was made in metalwork as well. And incidentally, I'm going to talk a bit more about this genealogy tomorrow, but interestingly, Gandhi based his whole education system for India on Ruskin's teaching along these lines, which comes from when he came across John Ruskin's book on political economy at a railway station in South Africa. But that's another story. So coming back up to date, what this means is that we're starting to think about how we could reintroduce the idea of use value back into art. So if you imagine the kind of Kant model, the romantic model of art that we had inherited for the past 150 years or so was based on the idea of pushing out usefulness within art. It was the idea of making something useless, or at least, as Kant would actually argue, it should be its purpose should be its purposelessness. And this really was something that had been lost from art, this kind of application, this role it would have in everyday life, something that Ruskin himself was saying. He actually said art should not be for its own sake, it should be for use and for social change. And here in a way, we started to pick up, as we were taking this interest in Ruskin and all these sorts of ideas, we started to come into conversation with a whole range of people from different institutions in different countries who were thinking along similar lines. And this led to an introduction through the Van Abbey Museum in Eindhoven, for me, to Tanya Bagheera, who's a Cuban artist at the time based in New York. And she had started already this idea of this movement called arte útil, art as a tool. But it was also something she had herself had evolved out of some work she'd done with Immigrant Movement International, which was a centre she made in New York for refugees. And also another idea she'd had around art as behaviour earlier on, and she ran a kind of behavioural art school. But nonetheless, we started to come together with a few people and said, actually, there's something happening here. As a way for us as a kind of art people, as art institutions, to find our way out of this world we're stuck in, which is very market-orientated, there might be a way we could kind of convene to develop some kind of movement, if you like, which would advocate for another way for art to work. And this really manifested itself as Arte Útil as a movement, and we created a website, and we created criteria through which it would guide us or allow us to analyse whether something was useful or not, or at least útil or not. And I'm going to do a workshop around this tomorrow. So if you are around, we can maybe go into this in more depth. But I'm not going to dwell on it for too long. But suffice to say that this thing grew and grew, where we created this website and a whole archive of what we call case studies from around the world of examples of art working in society as a tool for social change. And this is a very broad church, it's a very broad umbrella. But nonetheless, this started to amass in quite a convincing case for resurrecting this idea within our culture. And this manifests itself as the Museum of Arte Útil at Van Abbey Museum in 2013, a kind of major blockbuster show. You'll note the little cheeky joke of turning out the lights on Van Abbey Museum except for the letters U, S and E. And it was a kind of occupation of the institution as well, where really all the case studies were presented and the museum was brought to life with examples of artists working in all these different ways. And then we have a kind of committee, or at least a group that kind of develops the idea and works together to maintain the website and travel basically to different places, accumulating the knowledge as a collective operation. So it's been to, this is Office of Arte Útil in Tate, Liverpool. This is a conversation with Choto Delat, the Artist Collective, Birmingham, Zagreb, and also producing publications like this, which is like the big fat heavy book on the theory side of things. But at the same time, also other forms of exhibitions. This is an exhibition I co-curated at the Van Abbey Museum in 2014, which was really an alternative history of art according to use value. So kind of a more kind of study of the role of use in art from kind of 1800. Actually, it kind of the show started with John Ruskin and ended with the Arab Spring. We didn't go. We should have continued it, but we didn't. But you kind of get the idea. And this is a shot of a cheese school modular unit, which I'll talk about tomorrow. But this is Stephen Wright, who's kind of like the writer, art theorist, guru of usership, and he wrote for the exhibition a book called The Lexicon of Usership, which is out of print, but it's translated into Turkish. Or being translated into...
No, we didn't do that.
but it's now in 6 languages. The book, but it's basically as this thing grows and grows, this book is being adapted as it travels. But it's also available as a free PDF on the website if you want to have a look. But it basically talks about terminology that's coming in. So things like piggybacking, hacking, gaming. Talks about terminologies going out, such as authorship or spectatorship, and introduces this new language, which is much more about the world of usership rather than spectatorship. One of the terms in this lexicon is the term the Museum 3.0, which really I took as my cue for how I might start to reconfigure an art museum now. And the simple version of Museum 3.0 is maybe to say that Museum 1.0 is the old museum. So you put the precious objects in the gallery, people come in, and somehow they are better people for observing, looking at this work of art or whatever it might be. The Museum 2.0 is more in the realm, more recent trajectories of participation. So people come into the museum, they help co-produce what's in the gallery or the museum, but nonetheless, it's still playing to the museum's agenda. The curators, the expert culture, the art market still is in control of what that idea of art is. So the Museum 3.0 is moving more towards actually being the user-generated model of what an institution might be, that you open the doors, that you start to lose control, and you start to say this public institution is genuinely existing in the commons and created through the sum activities and ideas of its users. And that activity by its users is what creates the meaning. So this is something else that's quite interesting in terms of all this, this language, is you stop asking what art means and you start asking, how do I use it? And it is the use that creates meaning, and this has always been the case. So what does this actually look like is what I'm going to talk about now. And the first exhibition that I did at MIMA, which I did because I wanted to break the mold. I wanted to kind of send a message that this museum had changed because it was under attack. And obviously, historically, the museum had shown the great and the good of the art world as prescribed by London and New York and Beijing for 7 years since it opened. And so I basically conceived of doing a show which was an exhibition of local art. Because whenever you become a director of a museum, you get all the local artists saying, when are you going to show art by local people? When are you going to show people by us or for us? Mostly in the history of places like this, they refuse to do that because there's pressure to be part of the international art world. So they show Gerhard Richter and they show Louise Bourgeois and Joseph Beuys and all the usual names. And this is, of course, what MIMA did. It was trying to be international because it wanted to be international because it wanted to be like the Guggenheim. But of course, nobody cares. No one's going to come to Middlesbrough to see that because they can go and see it in every other city or town in the world as well. So I wanted to send this message, and I basically conceived this show called Localism, which was, again, is a terminology that comes from right-wing politics in the UK, which is about big society, or little, basically handing over control from the state to the people, theoretically. But the idea was to do a history of art in Middlesbrough from 1830 to the present day, but that we wouldn't decide what was in the show. We would basically open it up to the public, to the people of the town, to decide what should be in that exhibition, and for them to tell their story of the role of art in their community. So we did an open call through the local newspaper. We did events and workshops, really to collect the material that would then be in the exhibition, the blockbuster exhibition of local art. So workshops like this, and people bringing in packages, people donating banners from Communist Party banner, newspaper cuttings, old films. These are the drawings for the Sydney Harbour Bridge that was made in Middlesbrough, that we rescued from the archives. Basically, people bringing things in and contributing to them. And this is a map on the wall we created, which is, if you know Alfred Barr's diagram for the Museum of Modern Art in New York from 1933 was really kind of the blueprint for modernism. This is our version according to Middlesbrough on the wall with a kind of workshop on local fanzines. But you kind of get the idea. It was this accumulation device that built up a pile of material in the museum which told the story of this place. And it did have that transformational impact on our locality, where people would come in and go, yes, this is what MIMA should be doing. This is what we're interested in. This is the role that you should be having. This is a display of Linthorpe ceramics, which again was a kind of arte utile ceramic project from the 1880s in Middlesbrough, initiated by a designer called Christopher Dresser, where he would take clay from the ground, which was usually made for bricks, and turn it into ceramic, really high quality ceramics, which were then exported around the world, and the money came back to the community. So it was a kind of art, a social enterprise art project. And as also as part of the show, we reinvented this Linthorpe pottery with two artists living now to make new Linthorpe pottery out of the same clay from the ground. If you remember the bulldozed houses picture at the start, the soil where those houses had been knocked down was the soil we took to make these earthenware pots. And we even had a ceramic studio in the exhibition itself, which then ran workshops throughout the exhibition, teaching people how, again, to start to make things from the ground on which they walk. We also kind of reused history in another way. So in a way, history itself is a kind of example of usership. It's an example of how we take something and repurpose it to our own ends. And we do this with all aspects of history, but it's also quite a useful way of working within a context where we are now, where you can propose new ideas, but actually use history and precedent to say it's okay to do this, to give you permission. So this is an interesting story from Middlesbrough in the 1930s, which was in the Great Depression, when unemployment was 90%. Basically the wealthy family that lived in the town, in the big house in the town, they were radicalized by modernity, in effect, and they were communists. And they set up a work camp for unemployed miners to teach them agriculture, they taught them music, and they also taught them design and furniture making. And this is a photograph here of, on the left is Wilfrid Franks, who was trained at the Bauhaus, and he taught the miners furniture design. And on the right is Michael Tippett, who's a very sort of famous modernist composer in Britain, and he taught the miners music, and they created an opera which was about Robin Hood, which was a sort of communist manifesto in disguise with costumes, etc., etc., which we're trying to resurrect. Actually, we're going to remake the opera next year. But this is some of the original furniture from the 1930s that they made, and this is basically the new restarted enterprise, working with this artist, Adam Clark, third from the left, to teach unemployed now in design and furniture making, but using new technology. So basically taking kind of craft mechanisms, but updating them. So using CNC machines and computer-aided design and so on. And this has been used to refurbish the museum. So this is our new shop designed through this enterprise, and tables and chairs made in the workshops that are also for sale. So you can kind of sit in the museum and then buy the table and chair you sat at. And this now turns over about around £60,000 a year as a kind of micro industry. So what we're starting to do is embed these processes of making and these educational processes of making in the way the museum actually functions. And this is extending right throughout the program. So rather than education programs being separate to exhibitions, they're now fully integrated. It's kind of a holistic model of everything working together. And then we're also starting to use the Arte Utile archive to re-energize existing projects, or to learn from them in order to shape the program going forward. So this is number 513 from the archive, which is the Institute of Human Activity, initiated by Renzo Martins. And basically It's a program in the Congo, in Africa, and it's on the Lever, if you know Lever Brothers, the big or Unilever, the big multinational. It started out by basically it was a British industrialist, Lord Lever, who created plantations in the Congo, and these are the palm oil plantations that he set up. Where interestingly, that the workers originally were banned from producing their indigenous art by the plantation owners because it took them away from the labour market. But it was the same sculpture that they made that influenced Picasso and Braque in the Cubist era. So basically the idea of the Institute of Human Activity is to kind of gentrify the Congo, this, as Renzo calls it. It's very problematic, very difficult project, but essentially one of the aspects of this is that they're making art again and making these sculptures from the Congo River mud, which are then 3D scanned, emailed to Amsterdam, and then 3D printed and cast in chocolate from the plantations. This is Renzo on the left. Is Renzo with a sculpture called the Art Collector. And these sculptures are then sold on the international art market for very high prices, and the money goes back to the IHA in the Congo to support future development there. So it's a very complex project. And actually, quite a nice quote from it was shown in New York this year and was highlighted as one of the shows of the year in New York. The quote from the reviewer was, "You need to be fearless and run right into the swamp of possible misunderstanding to have any hope of making a difference," which I thought was quite an interesting take on the project. But this basically we did the show in MIMA. But the point was to have a show that is active, so not a show that's passive. So actually showing this work, no matter how problematic it is, but as part of a wider mechanism. And also to re-employ and rethink those projects for new circumstances. So historically, Renzo had only ever shown the work as his work, as Renzo Martins the artist, which I always had a problem with, of course. So we persuaded Renzo to basically lose Renzo's name completely from the show and to have it a show by the plantation workers of the Congo. And that each sculpture was credited with the name, etc., next to the sculpture by the person who actually made it. So we really suppressed the authorship of the artist, but raised the authorship of the collective idea and started to use it to talk about the conditions of migration and control of your circumstances, no matter how bad they are, within your own context. So within Middlesbrough, this proposition for a process actually started to have a lot of currency, and as it happens, we had quite a large Congolese population in Middlesbrough as well, who obviously then used the show themselves to start to change their outlook in how they would kind of control their circumstances, or how they would resist other people controlling their circumstances. Now, some of this led into the next project, which had this very long title, which came from Liam Gillick, because I worked many years ago on this project, which was to build the new Home Office headquarters for the British government in Westminster in London. And this phrase was to be used on the front of the building, but the government wouldn't allow it because they thought it was too left-wing, too utopian, and they were terrified of what the right-wing press would say, so they decided not to use it in the end. So I thought it'd be a nice name, nice for a show later on in life. So really what we wanted to do was to make an exhibition which responded to the migration crisis. And this really stems from the proposition I made as part of embedding Arte Útil in the institution, that we should respond to current urgencies. Everything we should do should be for a purpose. It should be to have effect in the world. It shouldn't be for the sake of making an art exhibition. It should be to try and make something change, no matter how small or no matter how great. So to address this issue of the red doors and the migration and the poor conditions in the town, we turned the gallery into a resource centre. So on the one hand, we sort of used it to advocate for the conditions of migrants and asylum seekers in the town. So we made a film with an artist to campaign for them. Within the show itself, which showed work by migrants and asylum seekers, both from an international art standing, but also art made by a lot of these communities on our front doorstep. We then also used the show as a campaigning platform for better conditions and a better understanding of this new age that we're living in, effectively. This is Tanya Bagheera speaking at our Arte Útil summit within the show at the time. But then also this project then started to infiltrate the whole institution. And that was kind of the design, that the exhibitions would start to shape the wider program, or at least our wider program, our public goal to make some change in the world should be supported by the exhibitions. And this is the reversal of what normally happens in an institution, because normally what happens in a museum is you put on the exhibitions, and the public programs and the education and the community work supports the exhibitions. Here we're totally turning it around. And this then starts to infiltrate everything you do. So the garden of the museum became a community garden, growing space for these same groups, who could then start to use it as a place to come together, to learn English, to start to represent themselves. This then also fed into a kind of a program around food. So whilst in the exhibition we had a weekly meal that was free because these people were hungry, we then continued this after the exhibition closed, and it's grown and grown, and now we basically have every Thursday in the museum we have a community day where people do classes and workshops, and there's a free lunch at 1 o'clock, which is made for by these same groups, and we attract up to around 100 people every lunchtime for this free meal. Again, this reverberates again through the program. So back into Gresham, this neighbourhood, we started working with a group of Eritrean refugees. And this is in our Office of Useful Arts at MIMA. We have a whole space dedicated to this idea. And really it's a place where people come to meet and plan and organise. And within this space, we worked with a group of Eritreans to make something quite simple, a coffee service, because they said that when they arrived, they couldn't find their traditional coffee pots to make to kind of do their ritual coffee service. So with Linthorpe, who were the artists who were making the ceramic pots out of the clay from the ground, we designed and made an Eritrean coffee service for Middlesbrough, which they could then use on kind of in their daily lives, but also we could use as part of our kind of ritual programming within the institution itself. And of course, then back to Margaret Thatcher, we also wanted to respond to Brexit at the time as well. So we created a whole exhibition which was about Margaret Thatcher and why she was solely responsible for the calamity that had fallen upon the world. And we created this exhibition which was around the history of Margaret Thatcher's influence on the world, the kind of how the hell we got into this mess exhibition. And another example of this kind of work continuing and growing and evolving was a project we did with the artist Daniela Ortiz. And she worked with basically single parents from North African backgrounds. And together they decided to remake this book that we found. And this is a book from 1899 called An ABC for Baby Patriots. And it's basically a book on how to make English children and turn them into colonial bastards to kind of get the world on its knees. I mean, pretty shocking actually, but you kind of get the idea from this picture what the book was about. And they remade the book according to their view of the world and according to their ideas of how they saw the migration control system, to kind of reclaim this territory, to reuse it, to piggyback it, to repurpose it to their ends, for them to advocate about the reality of what was going on, rather than the kind of mistruths that were being sold in the whole Brexit politicization. And interestingly, this exhibition got, this was a book, but also we displayed the book as an exhibition. And we had a police raid in the middle of the show because someone had complained that this show was racist to white people. which I kind of argued it's actually not possible to be racist to white people, but nonetheless we had the chief of police and the chief of hate crime and all these guys descend on the museum, where we had a big argument about whether, for example, Captain Cook was a biologist or a colonial conqueror. But interestingly, at the end of the conversation, the chief of police said, actually, this is really great. This is really good. This is the kind of stuff we should be doing to understand what's going on in our community. Can we do some more work with you? Can we come along to your community lunch? And can we start to use you to talk and negotiate with all these different communities with which we have problems? And interestingly now, we've just actually last week, they've invited us to do a public sculpture for the new police headquarters in Middlesbrough, which I don't have any images of. Next time. And also we've responded to the closure of the steelworks. So again, the whole program is centered around responding to the problems on our doorstep. Whether that's immediately on our doorstep or maybe that's kind of global doorstep, that's open to question. So we did an exhibition about the history of the steelworks, a kind of memorial, a kind of wake as the steel industry closed, but also proposed that it should be looking forward as well and not be negative. So we basically, on the right, we included in the show new industries from Middlesbrough, which are kind of high-tech startups. But on the left is kind of a workshop that we were doing with unemployed steelworkers who'd lost their jobs to plan. The map on the wall is a plan of the steelworks, which is huge. It's kind of 10 kilometers by 5 kilometers in area, about what we do with the site next. And that's now become a whole program working across the town in terms of planning the next phase of the city's development. And we've also extended it to our collections as well, because we have an art collection, because we are a museum, and we still acquire works of art. So the question is, how do you then adapt an art collection to this methodology? So of course, in our new collection displays, we've crowdsourced what that is. So our users have collectively decided and chosen what should go on the wall and how they interpret it and how they describe it. So, for example, this is a painting by Sonia Boyce, who's a kind of black artist from the 1980s in Britain. And interestingly, the museum bought this work 30 years ago, but never showed it. And there's a letter in the archive from the curator at the time saying, basically, we can't show this work because the people of Middlesbrough won't understand it, because it's of a different culture, theoretically. But then, interestingly, when we rehung it in the display, it was chosen for selection by this guy, which is Osama Khalil, who's actually interesting. He came to Middlesbrough as a refugee, well, as an asylum seeker, because he used to be an interior designer. He used to design Saddam Hussein's palaces in Iraq, but he just became politically embroiled and had a horrendous life, actually, subsequently, with torture and persecution. And his interpretation of the work was very different, and that it spoke to him in ways that he hadn't been spoken to before. Now, sadly, not long after this, Osama took his own life. He was very affected by his experiences and just couldn't take it anymore, sadly. But then we produced a memorial exhibition of his work at MIMA as well on the back of this, very quickly, very urgently. And this has now become a kind of campaigning touring exhibition around Britain to basically propose a different way of understanding and assimilating these people into our society. Carrying on from this, with these conversations with these constituents or these people on our doorstep, we decided that we needed to begin to start actively shaping the environment in which they live, or helping them with what they're trying to do in their daily lives. And a lot of this is about actually physically rebuilding that neighbourhood that I showed you with the demolished houses. How can you actually turn that into a place that you can live in and grow in as a community? And so we worked on this project earlier this year with the artist Isabel Lima and a group of local residents from this neighbourhood to build a wooden horse, as in the Trojan horse, like this. So this is a 5 metre high Trojan horse. And through this process, they learnt basic building skills, with the idea being that through building this horse, they could then start to take control of some of the broken properties and turn them into homes for themselves. So when the horse was made, we closed the streets, and the horse was wheeled through the streets of Middlesbrough to Gresham, this neighbourhood, where it acted as a kind. I mean, it was working in a symbolic way, but this was really about starting to send a signal that the people of the neighbourhood wanted to take control themselves of their own neighbourhood and not leave it to the government, not leave it to the urban planners to do some kind of mass scheme that had no relevance or no use for the people that live there. And on the back of this, we've now secured two properties in the neighbourhood that have been given by the council, handed over to the community, to this group, for them to redevelop themselves. And on the back of this, we've also, again, in this line, currently produced an exhibition called the Idea Home Show, which is kind of like a toolkit of ground-up activism around housing and basically building a home for yourselves. This is the Assemble Collective, which is a project that we acquired for the collection, which is basically a toolkit of how to make basically rebuild houses and interiors through using the kind of the rubble from the streets, and a room which is dedicated to basically housing activism. So this is a place where people can come to get ideas about how they might start to take control of their own environment and reshape it. So an example is that this is it's a project actually from the Arte Útil archive again by Nuria Guel, which is a project she did in Madrid, where basically people with no homes couldn't get access to vacant properties. So properties that had been dispossessed were lying empty while people had nowhere to live. So they worked basically on this illegal loophole where they realized if they took the doors off the empty buildings, you had a legal right to reside in the buildings with no doors. So there's basically a project of taking doors off buildings, which is then described in the video. And on the back of all this work within the exhibition, what we're now starting to do is work with architects and designers to design new housing for the Gresham neighbourhood with the community, where we're actually starting to get involved in building new homes and new houses that are co-designed and created by the users, by the people that are going to live in them, and actually built by them in reality, rather than being a proposition. So in a way, this starts to kind of bring the Arte Útil methodology to life. This is not about pointing at problems, this is not about describing problems, but actually providing and developing solutions collectively together. And kind of just to finish off with, we also extended this whole methodology to our branding, because I was conscious that as a changing institution, we also needed to change our brand, or at least our identity, or the way we talk to people. So in the space, over the summer, in the space that we normally use, or was designed actually by the Dutch architect friend of ours for the large sculpture, we left it empty, apart from painting the walls a colour. And in this space, we started to develop a new brand for the institution, a new visual identity, which would be co-designed by all our users. So using this kind of hacked print machine, we developed a kind of a language and a font that was described by, created by the machine, to then start to ask people how they saw the town, how they saw the museum, how they saw themselves, what kind of an institution they wanted. And this then would inform and create the look and the feel and the brand and the language with which we talked. And this is the kind of the font that we came up with, and the new logo for the museum, which was developed over the course of a year, but more importantly, began to describe ourselves in words that were chosen through all our different users during the day. And that's the finishing slide, theoretically. But the postscript to this is, on the back of all this work, I had an invitation a few months ago to take this idea on a bigger scale In February next year, I'm moving to become director of 2 institutions in Manchester. The Whitworth Art Gallery, which is this kind of glamorous 6-star Dubai hotel version of an art museum in Manchester, and the traditional City Art Gallery with over 2.5 million works of art in its collection. So the challenge now, I suppose, is now we've done this on a certain scale, would be to imagine this in the mainstream. So that maybe will be the next chapter, and I'm going to have to come back again and let you know whether I failed or not. But that's the end. Thank you very much.